truck stops, and church steeples. At precisely 10:05 a.m., the Orion Empire arrived to conquer Lake Winnebago. This was their first mistake. Truck stops and church steeples. They assumed the blindingly white expanse of the upper Midwestern winter was a dead zone. Truck stops and church steeples. Orbital thermal scans registered sub-zero temperatures and a scattering of unshielded wooden boxes dotting the ice. To the Imperial tactical models, it was a desolate landing zone. Truck stops and church steeples. To the local population, it was just the middle of the morning work shift. Hank Henderson stood beside his heavily salted 3/4-ton utility truck and watched the sky tear open. Truck stops and church steeples. He did not the seasoned lake crew foreman, instead unscrewed the cap of his dented thermos and poured a measured cup of scalding black coffee. Truck stops and church steeples. Steam plumed aggressively into the biting air. He took a slow sip. The dark liquid tasted like burned chicory and routine. Above him, the Orion flagship descended through low stratus clouds. Truck stops and church steeples. It was a sprawling geometric wedge of dark alloy and glowing blue propellant rays. It hovered a few hundred feet over the eastern ice shelf, displacing thousands of tons of freezing air. Truck stops and church steeples. The localized pressure dropped so fast that Hank felt his ears pop. A synthesized voice rolled across the frozen lake, declaring the sector minimally defended and demanding immediate capitulation. Truck stops and church steeples. Hank ignored the broadcast. He was focused entirely on the ice beneath his boots. The flagship's anti-gravity drives were actively pushing down on the frozen surface to maintain an atmospheric hover. Truck stops and church steeples. Hank gauged the weight of the alien vessel not as a military threat, but as a highly irritating environmental hazard. The displacement was going to alter the local pressure ridges. Truck stops and church steeples. If the alien ship kept hovering in that exact spot, the localized thermal bleed would stress the 30-inch ice sheet, potentially cracking the main structural seam. More importantly, truck stops and church steeples. The sudden shift in baromet to ruin the morning's ice fishing layout. Truck stops and church steeples. Now this glowing metal wedge was going to push the Walsey straight to the bottom of the lake. He screwed the cup back onto his dented thermos. Truck stops and church steeples. Mentally calculating the hours required to reroute the heavy equipment if the ice cracked. Hank hated rerouting the ice road. It involved paperwork, extra diesel, and dealing with the county. Truck stops and church steeples. He looked back up at the hovering dreadnought, feeling a profound sense of administrative fatigue. The Orion Empire had arrived to subjugate humanity. Truck stops and church steeples. Hank just wanted them to move their ship before they compromised his load-bearing ice. Aboard the flagship, Legion Commander Valen Krell stood on a polished command balcony. He wore the crisp truck stop as an elite Orion officer. Krell despised untidy conquests. He preferred clinical, mathematically perfect operations, truck stops, and church steeples. Relying entirely on predictive orbital models that reduced planetary defense to a series of simple algorithms, he gestured toward the sweeping holographic tactical display. Truck stops and church steeples. Zip. The primary sensor feeds Wisconsin shoreline as a jagged, low-value perimeter. Krell zoomed in on the scattered wooden shanties resting on the ice below. Truck stops and church steeples. The predictive AI categorized them as primitive refuse, likely abandoned shelters left behind by a fleeing populace. There were no energy shields. There were no vertical launch cells. Truck stops and church steeples. Krell smiled, a thin, bloodless smile. The landing zone was perfectly stable. He tapped the console. Truck stops and church steeples, preparing the operational orders to deploy his heavy ground transports. The resistance was mathematically zero, and the occupation would be completed ahead of schedule. Less than 2 miles away, truck stops and church steeples. Near the public boat launch, the indigenous population was not fleeing. They were arguing about municipal bylaws. Garth Miller and Dale Peterson stood near the frozen boat ramp. Truck stops and church steeples by stacked wooden pallets and cold water maintenance gear. Truck stops and church steeples. Garth, Hank's second-in-command on the ice crew, to scrape frozen mud from the treads of a utility tractor. He paused, leaning against the iron bar. Truck stops and church steeples, and squinted up at the massive warship blotting out the weak winter sun. Beside him, the deputy adjusted the collar of his thick sheriff's parka. Dale held a cheap truck stops and church steeples, lukewarm coffee in one hand and a citation clipboard in the other. He was entirely unconcerned with the strategic implications of an interstellar invasion fleet. He was, however, truck stops and church steeples. The Orion flagship's propulsion drives emitted a low-frequency vibration that rattled the metal siding of the nearby diner. Truck stops and church steeples. Garth tapped the pry bar against the tractor's tire. He looked over at the deputy. He did not ask about the end of the world. He asked about the township rules. Dale frowned. truck stops, and church steeples. Flipping a page on High's clipboard with a heavily gloved thumb, he stared at the glowing warship, trying to calculate its exact decibel output. Truck stops and church steeples. The county had incredibly strict noise ordinances in place before the deep midwinter freeze fully set in. Truck stops and church steeples. It was a measure originally designed to keep out-of-town snowmobilers from running modified exhausts past the residential cabins at dawn. Dale took a sip of his terrible coffee. Truck stops and church steeples. Evaluating the vessel against local code, Garth pointed a grease-stained finger at the sky. He noted that the continuous humming was definitely breaking the 85 decibel limit. Truck stops and church steeples. He also pointed out that the ship was technically hovering over a restricted marine traffic lane. Dale nodded. He pulled a pen from his pocket, his breath pluming in the freezing air. Truck stops and church steeples. He debated internally whether a cosmic invasion force fell under a standard noise complaint or if he needed to write them up for unauthorized commercial parking. Either way, truck stops and church steeples. The Orion Empire was in violation of Lake Sebago's zoning regulations, and Dale was not about to let out-of-toners ruin a perfectly quiet Tuesday. Truck stops and church steeples. His peace-spoken, Garth left the deputy to his paperwork truck. Over near the primary municipal pier, the air smelled of ozone and unburnt two-stroke oil. Truck stops and church steeples. Hank Henderson stood at the edge of the frozen concrete, evaluating the structural till of the ice sheet press pilings. He did not look at the sleek truck stops and church steeples. Matte black orb hovering 15 feet above his head. The Orion scout drone had been tracking his movements for the past 20 minutes. It emitted a low truck stops and church steeples. Sterile hum and periodically flashed a pale blue scanning laser across his work boots. Hank ignored the light. He reached down and adjusted the choke on his battered ice saw. Truck stops and church steeples. The machine was a heavy-duty industrial chainsaw modified with a 4-foot bar designed specifically for slicing through solid frozen geography. It was ugly, loud, truck stops and church steeples, and leaked a small amount of chain lubricant onto the snow. Garth arrived a moment later, a spuds bar, and watching the drone with mild annoyance. He leaned on the heavy iron shaft. Truck stops and church steeples. Let it click, the foreman replied. It doesn't understand thermal expansion. If we don't cut a relief line along this dock by noon, the pressure ridge is going to snap the timber. Truck stops and church steeples. The drone dropped lower, its optical cluster rotating. It projected a secondary beam into the dark, frozen slush directly beneath the crossbeams. The alien telemetry was highly sophisticated. Truck stops and church steeples, designed to map submolecular structural integrity. It was not designed to process the acoustic violence combustion engine operating at maximum RPM. Hank pulled the starter cord. Truck stops and church steeples. The exhaust spat a thick cloud of white smoke into the freezing air. The noise was not merely loud, it was a physical force, a deep truck stops and church steeples. Rattling mechanical scream that vibrated through the boot sole, he plunged the spinning bar directly into the frozen surface. Ice chips flew in a violent arc. Truck stops and church steeples. The heavy vibration hit the water column and echoed outward. Above them, the scout drone jerked erratic. Truck stops and church steeples. The overwhelming acoustic shockwave was intentionally scrambling its delicate sonar mapping array. The orb's blue light flickered to a harsh error state red. Truck stops and church steeples. It attempted to compensate by increasing sensor gain, which only fed more of the deafening mechanical frequency directly into its logic boards. The drone spun helplessly, emitted a sharp electronic whine, truck stops and church steeples, and retreated vertically to a safer altitude. Garth watched the machine flee into the low gray clouds. Guess it doesn't like the noise. Hank dragged the roaring blade along the edge of the wood, truck stops and church steeples, cutting a clean 3-inch gap between the sheet and the structure. The pressure released with a sharp, resonant crack that echoed across the bay. Ice is a dynamic fluid, Garth. Truck stops and church steeples, he explained over the idling engine. It drifts, it shifts under thermal load. Those orbital sensors think this lake is a solid floor. They don't know it breathes. He killed the throttle. Truck stops and church steeples. The sudden silence was replaced by the groaning of the massive frozen sheet adjusting its weight. They're going to put heavy equipment on that surface, the second-in-command noted. Truck stops and church steeples, pointing toward the distant Imperial landing zone. They are, Hank agreed, and we are going to finish cutting this relief line so they don't take our dock with them when they sink. A mile inland, truck stops and church steeples. The atmosphere of the lakeside bait-and-tackle diner was thick with the scent of roasted coffee, wet wool, and fried potatoes. Marcia Gable sat behind the main counter. Truck stops and church steeples, which currently served as the impromptu command center for the local waterboard crews. She held a ceramic mug in her left hand and a mechanical pencil in her right. Truck stops and church steeples. Auditing a stack of maintenance manifests, the door chimed. Dale Peterson stepped into the warm room, bringing a gust of freezing wind and a dusting of snow. The county sheriff's deputy looked exhausted. truck stops, and church steeples. His heavy winter coat was zipped to the chin, and his utility belt was currently weighed down by a portable radio and an ornate glowing metallic cylinder. Truck stops and church steeples. He walked to the counter and placed the alien artifact next to a display of neon-colored fishing lures. The cylinder hummed faintly, projecting a holographic text interface into the air. "What is that?" "Truck stops and church steeples." Marcia asked, not looking up from her paperwork. "Imperial decree," Dale replied, unzipping his jacket and rubbing his frozen hands together. A silver drone dropped it in the middle of the highway. "Truck stops and church steeples. It's broadcasting a mandatory surrender order in 6 different languages. Says we have to cease all unauthorized terrestrial movement and await processing by the Orion Legion. Truck stops and church steeples." Marcia finally looked at the glowing object. Was exceptionally crisp, detailing the absolute authority of the Empire. Truck stops and church steeples. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare and bureaucratic intimidation. "Does it have a local permit stamp?" she asked. The deputy blinked. "A what?" "A municipal authorization stamp. Truck stops and church steeples." The diner owner clarified, taking a slow sip of her coffee, "Because if they want to halt public works and close the county highway, they need to file a Form 204 with the Transit Authority. Truck stops and church steeple." Dale stared at the holographic threat of planetary subjugation. "I don't think the Orion Empire files local paperwork, Marcia." Truck stops and church steeples. "Then they don't get to block the intake valves." She set her mug down and pointed the pencil at him. "The slush is building up near the primary pump station. If that intake freezes over," truck stops and church steeples, "the municipal pipes are going to burst. I need you to ignore the glowing toy, take the municipal salt truck, and coordinate with the works crew to clear that ice before we lose water pressure." Truck stops and church steeples. The deputy sighed, accepting the inevitable hierarchy of rural priorities. An interstellar invasion was a theoretical problem. A frozen municipal water main was a catastrophic reality. "Copy that." Truck stops and church steeples. Dale said, "What do you want me to do with their surrender demand?" Marcia picked up the humming metallic cylinder. It felt cold and over-engineered. Truck stops and church steeples. She carried it over to a dented olive-green filing cabinet tucked beneath the cash register. She opened the second drawer, dropped the glowing artifact inside, and pushed the drawer shut with her hip. Truck stops and church steeples. The heavy steel casing instantly muffled the hum and completely blocked the holographic projection. She returned to her stool and picked up the pencil. "I filed it under pending shoreline permits." Truck stops and church steeples. "We process those on alternating Thursdays. Now get the salt truck moving, Dale. The temperature is dropping." Valen Krell stood on the lowered ramp of his command dropship, truck stops and church steeples, observing the sprawling white plains of the eastern shelf. The tactical display built into his visor registered the terrain as a level, unimpeded plateau. According to the Imperial orbital scans, truck stops and church steeples, the surface was a flat, unfortified expanse with no defense trenches, no energy shields, and no kinetic barriers. To the Legion commander, truck stops and church steeples. This pristine environment represented an ideal deployment zone for a rapid armored advance. He keyed his communications module and officially ordered the mechanized infantry to roll out. Truck stops and church steeples. It was an over-engineered marvel of the Orion Empire, designed to conquer hostile worlds by entirely bypassing their physical topography. Truck stops and church steeples. The heavy troop transport relied on a localized gravity nullification field. It floated exactly 36 inches to the surface. Truck stops and church steeples, projecting a stabilizing pressure cone downward while venting excess propulsion heat through a series of lower exhaust baffles. It was built to traverse shattered rocky craters, collapsed urban rubble, truck stops and church steeples, and hardened military compounds. It was not built to handle Lake Winnebago in late January. The massive transport glided forward over the ice. For the first 200 yards, truck stops and church steeples. The Imperial deployment looked flawless. The sledge moved with silent, frictionless grace, its ambient blue lighting reflecting sharply off the morning frost. Truck stops and church steeples. Inside the armored cabin, the alien operators monitored their weight distribution algorithms with absolute confidence. The internal computer continuously adjusted the anti-gravity output. Truck stops and church steeples, keeping the chassis perfectly level despite the immense payload of soldiers and weapons. Then the ruthless physics of freshwater thermodynamics took over. Truck stops and church steeples. The tactical model assumed the ground beneath them was a solid, static mass. It completely failed to account for the fact that the surface was a temporary truck stops and church steeples, semi-liquid crust floating above millions of gallons of shifting, moving water. The continuous downward pressure cone of the sledge began to severely stress the crystalline structure of the ice. Truck stops and church steeples. Worse, the extreme thermal radiation from the exhaust vents acted like a wide industrial blowtorch. The top layer of frost flashed instantly into steam. truck stops, and church steeples. The underlying ice turned into a treacherous, frictionless layer of melted water. A sharp, booming crack echoed across the silent bay. It sounded exactly like heavy artillery fire. Truck stops, and church steeples, but it was just the natural acoustic resonance of a massive pressure ridge snapping under localized thermal shock. The sledge's sophisticated telemetry systems detected a sudden truck stop in surface resistance. The algorithmic response was immediate, logical, and entirely wrong. Truck stops and church steeples. The computer attempted to stabilize the sinking vehicle by massively increasing downward thrust. The localized gravity field spiked, pushing harder against a surface that no longer existed. Truck stops and church steeples. The ice shattered completely. The heavy Imperial transport plunged straight through the frozen crust. Freezing murky water rushed violently over the lower intake manifolds. Truck stops and church steeples. Warning klaxons blared inside the sealed cabin. The operators frantically tried to reroute power to the upper repulsors, but the massive vehicle was already bogged down in a slushy truck stops and church steephole. The more they engaged the engines, the faster the surrounding ice melted away. Truck stops and church steeples. Valen watched from the safety assault transport turned itself into a multi-ton anchor. There was no enemy ambush. There was no kinetic sabotage. Truck stops and church steeples. His elite vanguard had simply parked a heavy heat-venting engine on a frozen lake. The vehicle settled into the freezing mud with a final pathetic hiss of steam. Truck stops and church steeples. Trapped entirely by its own superior engineering. Less than a quarter-mile away, the mundane local traffic continued without interruption. Truck stops and church steeples. Hank Henderson adjusted the throttle on his flat-bottom utility boat. The wide, shallow-draft vessel was heavily battered, stained with years of green algae. Truck stops and church steeples, and smelled faintly of diesel exhaust and old bait. It lacked anti-gravity sensors or a sophisticated tactical AI. Instead, it had a loud truck stops and church steeples, unrefined two-stroke outboard motor, and an operator who knew exactly where the underwater sandbars lived. Garth Miller stood near the bow, holding a long, weather-beaten wooden-sounding pole. Truck stops and church steeples. He was not scanning the horizon for enemy troop movements or orbital strikes. He was carefully looking at the color of the slush. The two men navigated their boat along a natural pressure seam. Truck stops and church steeples. They knew the bay's complex undercurrents. They understood that the water moving constantly beneath the ice created thinner, highly unstable patches near the eastern shelf. Truck stops and church steeples. It was a dynamic moving entity that required absolute respect, localized knowledge, and a complete lack of arrogance. Truck stops and church steeples. They steered the flat bottom smoothly around a jagged outcropping of newly shattered ice. Just beyond the ridge, the glowing grav sledge sat hopelessly mired in the freezing water. Truck stops and church steeples. The high-tech transport was tilted a humiliating 45-degree angle. Its gravity field had shorted out entirely. Truck stops and church steeples, leaving the heavy metallic chassis resting deep at the muddy bottom of the shallows. Around the sinking vehicle, a squad of Imperial infantrymen had been forced to abandon the flooding cabin. Truck stops and church steeples. The alien soldiers wore pristine temperature-regulated combat armor. They carried advanced energy rifles capable of vaporizing titanium bulkheads. Truck stops and church steeples. They were currently standing knee-deep in a miserable mixture of freezing water, crushed ice, and decaying lakeweed. Their advanced boots, designed for magnetic traction on metallic ship decks, truck stops and church steeples possessed absolutely zero grip on wet, slushy clay. Every time one of the soldiers tried to take a step, the internal gyros whined in protest, and they slipped further into the freezing muck. Truck stops and church steeples. Hank eased back on the throttle, letting the flat bottom drift slowly past unfolding disaster. The outboard motor churned quietly in the frigid morning air. One of the armored invader truck stops and church steeples, standing waist-deep near the sunken exhaust vent, looked up at the passing human vessel. The alien's glowing optical visor locked onto the rusted aluminum hull. The soldier raised a hand. Truck stops and church steeples. Freezing in place, unsure whether to aim his weapon, issue a foreprokta tow line. Garth leaned heavily on his wooden pole. He did not reach for a rifle. Truck stops and church steeples. He did not offer a grand dramatic speech about humanity's indomitable spirit or the folly of empires. He simply looked down at the freezing, stranded elite legionnaire. Garth offered a brief truck stops and church steeples polite nod. It was the exact same nod he used when a tourist from Illinois ignored the local warning signs, drove a leased luxury sedan onto the thin ice, and immediately sank it up to the axles. Truck stops and church steeples. It was a gesture of profound localized pity mixed with an absolute refusal to intervene. "Watch the prop on that submerged stabilizer strut," Garth said, not bothering to look back at the aliens. truck stops, and church steeples. "I see it," Hank replied, his breath pluming in the cold air. Hank nudged the tiller. The flat-bottom boat slid cleanly past the mired invasion force, riding the natural current with truck stops and church steeples' effortless ease. They left the Imperial vanguard to fight the freezing water alone. Truck stops and church steeples. The humans had a job to do, and a sunken alien transport was nothing more than an unpermitted navigational hazard. Marcia Gable stood on the edge of the municipal maintenance pier. Truck stops and church steeples. Watching the advance of the Orion reconnaissance squad, the Imperial infantry moved in a flawless diamond formation, their polished armor gleaming to a military academy instructor. Truck stops and church steeples. The maneuver was a textbook display of disciplined force projection. To a Wisconsin diner owner who had spent 40 years watching overconfident tourists lose their snowmobiles to the lake, truck stops and church steeples. It was an administrative problem. "They're taking the shipping lane," Marcia said over her handheld radio. "They didn't even check the depth charts. A mile down the shoreline, truck stops and church steeples." Dale Peterson knelt beside a frost-covered municipal utility box. The county deputy wore insulated coveralls and a pair of heavy leather work gloves. In his right hand, he held a rusted wrench. Truck stops and church steeples. "Copy that," the deputy replied. "I'm on the primary manifold. Just say the word." The Orion squad continued their march. Their tactical visors actively mapped the terrain, truck stops and church steeples, classifying the vast white expanse as solid bedrock. They did not understand that ice is a shifting medium, and they did not know about the bubbler system. Designed by the local water district, truck stops and church steeples. The submerged aeration network circulated warmer water from the deep lake bed to the surface, preventing ice from forming thick enough to crush the dock pilings. "Wait for it," Marcia murmured. Truck stops and church steeples, watching the glowing visors through a pair of battered binoculars. "Let them commit to the main lane." Dale tightened his grip on the rusty wrench, seating the iron jaws onto the primary release valve. Truck stops and church steeples. The old pipes groaned under the pressure of the suppressed air compressors. He timed the rhythmic thud of their armored boots, using the heavy footsteps of the Imperial troops as a perfect metronome. Truck stops and church 20. "Hit it." The deputy threw his weight against the tool. The heavy iron valve squealed, breaking free of its frozen seal. Truck stops and church steeples. Deep beneath the surface, dormant compressors roared to life. A massive surge of compressed air rushed through the network, driving warmer bottom water violently upward against the ice sheet. Truck stops and church steeples. The thick, insidious lane was eaten away from beneath in seconds, leaving a deceptively fragile millimeter of surface frost. The lead soldier stepped forward. Truck stops and church steeples. The ice did not crack. It simply vanished beneath his boots. With a wet splash, the vanguard of the reconnaissance unit plummeted straight through the surface. Truck stops and church steeples. They did not drown, was only 4 feet deep, but the sudden immersion to sub-zero water and gelatinous mud paralyzed their mobility. Truck stops and church steeples. Their servo-assisted armor was designed to repel plasma fire, not to navigate freezing aquatic silt. The remaining troops halted as the localized gravity fields of their suits shorted out. Truck stops and church steeples. Marcia lowered her binoculars. She stated dryly, "Tell the boys at the bait shop we might need a tow truck by mid-afternoon. Aboard the hovering command transport. Truck stops and church steeples." Valen Krell stared at his primary holographic display. The tactical projection of the shoreline was supposed to be a straightforward grid of conquered territory. Instead, truck stops and church steeples. His elite infantry units were breaking formation, their transponder signals drifting aimlessly across the sector map. "Explain this lack of cohesion," the Legion commander demanded. "Truck stops and church steeples. The surface is a flat, unresisting mineral plain. Why is the 3rd Infantry scattered?" "Commander," the tactical officer replied. "The units encountered a series of primitive wooden markers. Truck stops and church steeples. The predictive models classified them as insignificant native debris and advised bypassing them for a more direct vector." The commander narrowed his eyes. Truck stops and church steeples. The lake crews had spent the morning driving those wooden trail flags into the ice. To Imperial censors, they were meaningless trash. To anyone who lived in the region, church steeples, they marked the only tested paths across the frozen expanse. Truck stops and church steeples. By ignoring the flags, the Orion infantry marched directly into a network of treacherous pressure ridges. 3 miles out on the ice, Hank Henderson leaned against his work truck. Truck stops and church steeples. The lake crew foreman watched the Imperial troops struggle through the jagged, buckling hills of ice. When wind-driven ice plates collide, they crush upward into violent truck stops and church steeples, chaotic ridges that are structurally unstable. Through the biting wind, the foreman heard the whine of high-yield thermal emitters, the Orion soldiers, truck stops, and church steeples. Unable to climb the slick blocks of ice in heavy armor, had decided to burn a path through the obstacle. "You've got to be kidding me," Hank muttered. A squad of invaders raised heavy laser cutters. truck stops, and church steeples, directing thermal energy at the base of the pressure ridge. The ice began to melt, sending clouds of steam billowing into the freezing air. To the alien troops, it seemed like a logical truck stops and church steeples. Brute force solution. They did not understand the physics of a frozen lake. The pressure ridge was a localized release of immense kinetic tension holding the surrounding plates together. Truck stops and church steeples. By rapidly applying extremes melted the structural keystone of the entire shelf. A sound like a cannon shot echoed across the bay. Truck stops and church steeples. The thermal caused the ice to fracture violently. The ridge collapsed into a chaotic soup of shifting blocks, freezing water, and expanding cracks. The ground buckled beneath their weight. Truck stops and church steeples. As the freezing slush rushed in to fill the newly melted gap, it immediately refroze around their armored boots, locking them firmly into the slush pack. Truck stops and church steeples. The laser cutters sputtered and died as the shifting ice buried their power couplings in mud and water. The infantrymen stood frozen in place, trapped waist-deep in the buckling shelf. Truck stops and church steeples. Visors darting around in absolute confusion, Hank keyed his local CB radio from the cab of his work truck. The impending lake effect squall did not announce itself with a grand atmospheric disturbance. Truck stops and church steeples. It simply arrived, dropping the ambient temperature by 15 degrees in 3 minutes and erasing the horizon behind a solid horizontal wall of white. Truck stops and church steeples. Visibility on the surface of Lake Winnebago shrank to less than 4 feet. To the Orion Empire, this sudden meteorological shift registered as a Class 4 navigational hazard. Truck stops and church steeples, an extreme environmental anomaly that demanded immediate lockdown procedures. To the local residents, it was Tuesday afternoon. Now out of his truck, Hank Henderson stood on the freezing surface, truck stops and church steeples, ignoring the biting wind that battered his heavy insulated canvas jacket. He did not look up at the glowing alien warships holding a steady pattern somewhere in the blinding snow above. Truck stops and church steeples. Beside him, Dale Peterson leaned his weight against a massive, detached ice floe. Truck stops and church steeples, his boots slipping slightly on the slick surface before finally finding purchase. Neither man spoke for several long minutes. They worked entirely by touch and ingrained muscle memory. Truck stops and church steeples. The foreman secured a heavy-duty industrial carabiner to the mounting bracket bolted into the ice. The metal was cold enough to strip skin from an ungloved hand. Truck stops and church steeples. But he handled it with the casual disregard of a man who had done this 1,000 times. The plan was simple, mechanical, and entirely invisible to the invaders. By securing tow lines to the loose, truck stops, and church steeples. Floating sections of the shelf, the two men were systematically dragging heavy drift ice directly into the designated landing lanes of the Imperial Advance. The local lawman locked his side of the winch. Truck stops and church steeples, verifying the tension as the thick steel line hummed in the howling wind. Satisfied, truck stops and church steeples. He stepped back and let out a long breath that instantly crystallized in the freezing air. Hank reached into the cab of the idling work truck stops and church steeples, his hand bypassing the complex radio equipment to retrieve his dented thermos. He unscrewed the cap, poured a steaming cup of scalding black coffee, and handed it to the deputy. Truck stops and church steeples. Letting the ambient heat sink through his thick gloves, he took a long drink. The liquid was strong, bitter, and entirely necessary. Truck stops and church steeples. The foreman muttered a low grunt of approval, taking a sip straight from the rim of the metal container. The winch whined, truck stops, and church steeples, gears grinding as it pulled 5 tons of frozen mass smoothly across the black water. The ice drifted right into the primary approach vector the aliens had established. Somewhere in that white void, truck stops and church steeples. The highly advanced invaders were relying on optical sensors that were currently blinded by dense snow and thermal imaging matrices that could not penetrate the freezing particulate. Truck stops and church steeples. The surface was an uninhabitable hazard zone devoid of life. To the men drinking coffee by the truck stops, and church steeples, the blinding whiteout was just a highly convenient cover to go about their daily task without being bothered by out-of-toners. Aboard the primary atmospheric command transport, truck stops, and church steeples. Valen Krell stared at a tactical holographic display that was slowly driving him mad. The advanced intelligence suite of the Orion Empire was designed to monitor high-energy weapons discharges, truck stops, and church steeples, mechanized troop movements, and orbital defense grids. It was not designed to map the chaotic dynamic shifting of frozen water in a zero-visibility blizzard. The projection flickered. Truck stops and church steeples, attempting to render the changing shoreline and then reset itself for the 4th time in 10 minutes. The Legion commander tapped the crystalline interface. truck stops, and church steeples. Demanding a clear picture of the surface resistance, the system responded by filtering out anything that lacked a localized energy shield or an active weapons system. Down on the lake, truck stops, and church steeples, the heavy municipal water district tugboats were grinding their way through the slush. Because the working vessels possessed thick steel hulls, operate at speeds under 6 knots, truck stops, and church steeples, and emitted only low-level diesel exhaust, the Imperial targeting algorithm confidently classified them as harmless environmental debris. Truck stops and church steeples. To the predictive models, the surface of the lake was devoid of military assets. To reality, the local crews were building a cage. The situation was compounded by the communications intercept matrix. Truck stops and church steeples. The Imperial systems easily cracked the unencrypted VHF radio frequencies used by the locals. However, translating the words did not mean the artificial intelligence understood the meaning. Truck stops and church steeples. In the warm, grease-scented interior of her lakeside diner, Marcia Gable held a battered microphone to her mouth, completely ignoring the Imperial dropships hovering over her roof. Truck stops and church steeples. The diner owner pressed the transmission button, her voice flat and entirely unbothered by the cosmic stakes. She had traffic to manage. According to the translation scroll on the alien bridge, truck stops and church steeples, the human transmission read clearly. It stated that a heavy walleye run was pushing toward the central shoal. It requested that the blue tip-ups be moved to the east ridge before the ice shifted. Truck stops and church steeples. It commanded the red sled to come around the back channel. Valen watched the text render on his display. The tactical AI processed the message, truck stops and church steeples, cross-referenced it with known human military terminology, and flagged the transmission as a biological marine feeding observation. Truck stops and church steeples. It determined that the indigenous population was discussing local fish migration patterns during a blizzard, classified the behavior as deeply irrational, truck stops and church steeples, and dismissed the audio feed as non-threatening static. What the billion-credit system failed to parse was that the diner owner was actively coordinating the movement of 3 heavy-duty tugboats, truck stops, and church steeples. The walleye run was the creeping advance of Orion infantry across the ice. The blue tip-ups were the heavy drift flows that the foreman was currently winching into place. Truck stops and church steeples, and the red sled was a reinforced icebreaker moving in to block the aliens' only safe retreat path. Truck stops and church steeples. Krell slammed his gauntlet against the command console as another error message flared on the display. Truck stops and church steeples. His perfectly disciplined, technological superior invasion force was currently bogged down in a freezing white void, their sensors useless, truck stops and church steeples, and completely unaware that they were being systematically corralled by people who relied on fishing slang and heavy diesel engines. Only one sector remained seemingly viable for his heavy units: truck stops and church steeples. The eastern shelf of Lake Peninsula of solid, wind-scoured ice connecting the main shoreline to the deeper outer bay, desperate to break out, truck stops and church steeples. The Orion M classified this thick shelf as a stable deployment causeway, seeking firm ground, truck stops and church steeples. Heavy armored units, specifically their wide-stance artillery sledges, began rolling outward to establish a commanding perimeter. From the heated cab of the municipal maintenance truck, truck stops and church steeples. Hank watched the massing machinery. The foreman did not see an impenetrable military formation. He saw an overloaded weight distribution resting on a seasonal thermal fault line. Truck stops and church steeples. He tapped a gloved finger against the steering wheel, indicating the natural seam. His second-in-command understood the assignment without a formal briefing. Garth stepped out into the freezing wind, truck stops and church steeples, pulling the battered ice saw from the flatbed. The heavy-duty tool was loud, cumbersome, and leaked a small amount of dark oil onto the pristine white surface. The mechanic primed the engine. Truck stops and church steeples, pulled the starter cord, and let the 2-stroke motor scream to life. He did not march into combat. Truck stops and church steeples. He walked to the exact geological stress point of the ice bridge and angled the 4-foot bar downward. The teeth bit heavily into the frozen surface. Truck stops and church steeples. Slush and jagged shards sprayed backward in a wire, coating his insulated coveralls. The saw chewed cleanly through the clear top layer, hitting the softer, porous white ice beneath. Truck stops and church steeples. The violent noise was deafening, of the alien artillery platforms massing just 30 yards away. Truck stops and church steeples. An Imperial telemetry drone, roughly the size of a dinner plate, descended from the gray sky to investigate the acoustic disturbance. It hovered directly at eye level. Truck stops and church steeples, emitting a high-intensity red targeting laser straight across the mechanic's face. The glare hit Garth right in the protective goggles, making it difficult to maintain a straight cutting line. Truck stops and church steeples. He did not drop his tool. He did not throw his hands up in surrender. He simply raised his left hand and swatted the drone backward with his thick leather glove. Truck stops and church steeples, treating the highly advanced surveillance equipment exactly like a persistent summer mosquito. The machine spun wildly, its internal gyroscopes whining as it struggled to recalibrate its flight path. Truck stops and church steeples. By the time the drone stabilized, the mechanic had already reached the waterline. Garth cut the throttle. The sudden silence was replaced by a deep, resonant crack that echoed across the entire bay. Truck stops and church steeples. The fracture propagated perfectly along the invisible stress line, snapping the structural spine of the frozen causeway. 3 massive Orion artillery sledges suddenly shifted. Truck stops and church steeples. The solid ground beneath from the shoreline, becoming a freestanding buoyant island. The slow truck stops and church steeples. Relentless subsurface current immediately began pushing the newly formed floe toward the open water. The heavily armored platforms were completely isolated. Truck stops and church steeples. Marooned on a shrinking raft of drifting debris. Garth was lush from his goggles, turned his back on the stranded vanguard, and walked back to the truck. Further down the shoreline, truck stops and church steeples. The main Imperial landing crafts remained parked in the sheltered municipal basin. The alien logistics commanders had assessed the harbor as a mathematically secure staging zone. The surface was truck stops and church steeples. The perimeter was defined, and their stabilizing pylons had easily gripped the frozen top layer. They did not understand that the lake was not solid ground. It was a massive truck stops, fluid entity expanding and contracting under immense thermal pressure. Truck stops and church steeples. The owner of the lakeside bait and tackle diner understood these pressure dynamic intimately. Marcia walked out onto the wooden boardwalk, carrying a rusted iron crowbar. Truck stops and church steeples. The heavy winter jacket she wore insulated her from the biting crosswind, though she moved with the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone merely completing a tedious seasonal chore. Truck stops and church steeples. Deputy Peterson followed a few paces behind, his hands shoved deep into his uniform pockets. He watched the massive, sleek alien ship sitting quietly in the harbor. Truck stops and church steeples. Then he watched the diner owner approach the heavy mooring chains of the municipal floating pier section. Truck stops and church steeples. These modular docks were specifically anchored to act as a tension buffer against the winter pack shift. They held back millions of tons of creeping, expanding ice from crushing the inner harbor walls. Truck stops and church steeples. The alien landing crafts were parked directly the designated expansion zone. Marcia jammed the flat end of her crowbar under the primary locking pin of the main tension chain. Truck stops and church steeples. She leaned her entire body weight against the iron bar. The rusted metal groaned, scraped, and suddenly popped free. The heavy chain whipped violently into the dark water. Truck stops and church steeples. She moved to the next mooring point and repeated the process. Within 4 minutes, the entire floating pier system was unlatched. Truck stops and church steeples, removing the only structural barrier holding back the seasonal compression wave. The lake did not hesitate. The sound began as a low, vibrating hum that rattled through the soles of their boots. Truck stops and church steeples, escalating into a series of sharp explosive cracks. A massive sheet of pack ice surged forward into the basin, driven by the unstoppable lateral force of the entire frozen bay. Truck stops and church steeples. The leading edge of the ice pack slammed to the nearest Imperial landing craft. Truck stops and church steeples. The ship's advanced stabilizers were engineered to withstand the extreme heat and vertical turbulence of atmospheric reentry. They were completely unprepared for the slow truck stops and church steeples. Of 1,000,000 tons of moving freshwater ice, the alien alloy buckled. Truck stops and church steeples. Warning alarms shrieked across the basin as the pristine stabilizing legs sharply inward. The heavy hull of the transport shifted. Truck stops and church steeples, tilting dangerously as the ice simply folded over the metallic supports, splintering the sophisticated engineering into useless jagged shrapnel. Dale stood safely on the boardwalk. Truck stops and church steeples, watching the geological machinery systematically dismantle the interstellar transport. He adjusted the collar of his jacket against the wind, his expression entirely neutral. "You know, truck stops and church steeples," the deputy observed, his voice barely raising above the horrific sound of crushing metal. "If we had to tow those things out of here with the municipal tractors, truck stops and church steeples, it would have ruined the department's maintenance budget." Marcia rested the heavy crowbar against the toe of her boot. "Nature is highly efficient. Saves us a fortune on diesel fuel," Dale agreed. Truck stops and church steeples, watching another set of alien landing struts snap like dry pine twigs under the pressure ridge. He nodded toward the street. "Lunch rush is starting. We should head back before the soup gets cold." truck stops, and church steeples. The command deck of the primary Orion Empire dropship was supposed to be a temple of clinical efficiency. Valen Krell stood at the central holotable. Truck stops and church steeples. The atmospheric scrubbers were working overtime to process the moisture bleeding into the ship from retrieved vehicles. The polished black floor was streaked with freezing mud and industrial grease. Truck stops and church steeples. The holographic projection of Lake Winnebago flickered violently. The predictive combat models had finally stopped trying to formulate a counterattack. Truck stops and church steeples. The orbital intelligence software was completely frozen, trapped in an infinite calculation loop trying to map a terrain that kept shifting and melting under its own parameters. Truck stops and church steeples. Cian stared at the glowing red markers on the display. Three were isolated on detached slabs of ice. Two highly expensive glowing grav sledges rested at the bottom of the bay. Truck stops and church steeples, fully submerged because a local bubbler system had degraded the surface tension. Truck stops and church steeples. There was no organized military resistance. There were no artillery emplacements or fortified bunkers. There were only men in heavy coats driving rusted utility vehicles, truck stops, and church steeples, systematically dismantling the battlefield piece by piece. Report, Valen demanded. The senior tactical officer hesitated, his polished armor smeared with dirty snow. Commander, truck stops and church steeples. However, indigenous low-yield watercraft are circling the ice flows. Are they preparing a kinetic bombardment? Valen asked. Truck stops and church steeples. Have they brought up heavy ordnance? Negative, the officer replied, looking deeply uncomfortable. They are using localized acoustic amplification devices. Truck stops and church steeples. They are offering the infantry units heated caffeine-based liquid in exchange for immediate salvage rights to our submerged propulsion modules. Valen closed his eyes. Truck stops and church steeples. His legion had broken heavily fortified asteroid bases. Now his elite troops were trapped in a freezing puddle, aggressively haggled by civilians in insulated overalls. Truck stops and church steeples. The localized thermal readings on the holotable flashed amber. Environmental generators on the deployed transports were starting to redline. The extreme sub-zero ambient temperature. Truck stops and church steeples, combined with structural failures of the ice sheet beneath them, was overwhelming the stabilization algorithms. Truck stops and church steeples. The local water actively drained the power reserves of every machine at the surface. Recall them, Valen said quietly. Commander, recall all remaining surface units, Valen ordered. Truck stops and church steeples. Initiate emergency extraction protocols for the stranded platoons. Dropship for high-orbit ascension. We are leaving. The officer blinked. Truck stops and church steeples. His rigid military conditioning fighting the concept of retreat. Sir, the invasion mandate. There is no invasion, Valen snapped. He activated his personal command log. Truck stops and church steeples. I am reclassifying this entire sector. The designated target zone is an unstable semi-liquid swamp. Truck stops and church steeples. The terrain is geographically hostile and completely devoid of strategic value. The region is inhabited exclusively by erratic, low-yield mechanical units operating without centralized logic. He paused. Truck stops and church steeples, refusing to look back at the screen where local boats navigated the chaotic ice flows. He would not log that he had been outmaneuvered by dock workers. He would log a thermodynamic anomaly. Truck stops and church steeples. The sector quarantined, Valen finished. Mark it as structurally condemned. Spin up the primary thrusters on the eastern shoreline. Truck stops and church steeples. The temperature plummeted as the pale winter sun dipped closer to the tree line. The wind coming off the lake was sharp enough to cut through 3 layers of thermal canvas. Truck stops and church steeples. Hank Henderson stood on the edge of the public boat launch, watching the massive glowing hull of the Orion dropship lift slowly into the freezing sky. Truck stops and church steeples. The displacement of air kicked up a squall of pulverized ice, rattling the corrugated metal roof of the nearby bait shop. The deep mechanical roar of the alien thrusters shook the ground. Truck stops and church steeples. He did not flinch. He just reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his dented thermos. Hank unscrewed the cap with cold, stiffened fingers. He tipped the steel container. Truck stops and church steeples, pouring the last half cup of warm, sludgy black coffee into the lid. He took a slow sip. The coffee tasted like burnt copper and old grounds. Truck stops and church steeples, exactly the way it always did by the end of a long Tuesday shift. Beside him, Garth Miller was methodically coiling a length of heavy-duty tow cable next to the battered ice saw. Truck stops and church steeples, tossing the loops into the bed of their work truck. His thick gloves were coated in frozen grease and lake water. Well, Garth muttered, tossing the final coil into the truck bed with a loud clatter. Truck stops and church steeples. That was a whole lot of noise for absolutely nothing. Hank nodded, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He looked down at the concrete ramp leading into the water. Truck stops and church steeples. The localized thermal radiation from the departing dropship's thrusters was washing over the shoreline. truck stops, and church steeples. The intense, unnatural heat had rapidly melted the thick layers of black ice that had clogged the East boat launch since mid-December. The concrete was now completely clear, steaming gently in the twilight. Truck stops and church steeples. "Saves us a job," Hank observed dryly. "I was going to bring the salt truck down here tomorrow. Guess they were good for something after all." Truck stops and church steeples. Dale Peterson pulled his county cruiser up to the edge of the ramp, tires crunching loudly over the frozen gravel. The deputy rolled his window down, letting a blast of warm air escape. Truck stops and church steeples. He looked up at the fading exhaust trail, then back at the lake crew. "Dispatch wants to know if we need the state boys to come down and secure the perimeter," Dale said. "Also, truck stops and church steeples. The mayor is asking if we should declare a state of emergency." "Tell dispatch the perimeter is fine," Hank replied, securing the cap back onto his dented thermos. Truck stops and church steeples. "And tell the mayor that if he declares an emergency, he has to pay us overtime for the cleanup. That usually shuts him up." Marcia Gable walked down from the diner. Truck stops and church steeples. Her heavy insulated jacket zipped up to her chin. She carried a clipboard in one hand and a heavy flashlight in the other. She aimed the beam across the newly cleared channel. Truck stops and church steeples, checking the water flow near the municipal aerators. The bubbler system was operating perfectly, keeping the vital shipping lanes open despite the plunging temperatures. "You boys done playing in the water?" Truck stops and church steeples, Marcia asked, her voice carrying easily over the sound of the wind. "Because I've got 2 pots of chili on the stove, and if you don't eat it, I'm throwing it to the gulls." "We're done," Hank said. Truck stops and church steeples. He walked over to his truck and placed a heavy hand on the tailgate. He looked out over the vast, darkening expanse of Lake Winnebago. The ice sheet was cracked, fractured, truck stops and church steeples, and littered with the frozen wreckage of alien ambition, but the water beneath it was still moving. The lake was exactly where it belonged. Garth climbed into the passenger seat and church steeples, slamming the rusted door twice to make the latch catch. Truck stops and church steeples. Hank walked around to the driver's side. There were no grand declarations of victory. There were no flags planted in the snow. An empire had arrived expecting no resistance, and instead, truck stops and church steeples. They had encountered a community that considered extreme cold, broken machinery, and massive logistical headaches to be standard operating procedure. Hank started the truck. Truck stops and church steeples. The old engine turned over with a painful, mechanical whine before settling into a steady idle. He threw the heater on high, shifted into gear, and drove slowly away from the launch. Truck stops and church steeples. The ice road was clear, and tomorrow was Wednesday. They had work to do.